and those tuning in for the first time. And welcome. This is a weekly show that we do to help everybody to build that mindset for success. And this week we have the extra special guest, Elizabeth Diacos. Welcome, Elizabeth, and thank you for being on the show today.
Hi, Michelle. Thanks so much for having me. It's really great to be here.
It's so wonderful to have Elizabeth and to have her talking on a particular topic today, which is very dear to people's hearts, near and dear to people's hearts, changing careers and going through what can be for some a difficult transition. So Elizabeth is an ex-educator herself, but she now is a specialist in working with career transitions for educators. She's the founder and owner of Lightsong Enterprises, and she's been helping educators in one form or another through her Facebook group, where she's got 13,500. That's a lot of people in your Facebook group there. But she has so many more skills and expertise and experience that we're going to unpack throughout the show today. But first, Elizabeth, I'm sure everybody's wondering, how do you go from being a teacher to being a career transition coach and all the other elements of how you came to be you and so successful today? Please share your story with their viewers.
Oh, thanks, Michelle. Well, first of all, I had a whole lot of babies, so I actually got into teaching quite late. We have five children, and so one day I woke up and said, "Okay, that's it. I have to, I need to go and have a career now. Like I've done with the child raising, or I was, nearly done." And so I went back to uni. I already had a degree from, the dark ages, and then went back to uni and studied fine art, which turned out not to be a really great career path. And so then I picked up a teaching qualification straight after that. And I worked I was a secondary trained teacher, but I actually worked in a primary school teaching performing and visual arts for about 8 years, sort of over. So it was probably about 6 years of equivalent of full-time teaching over an 8-year period. So I did a bit of part-time work, and I did take some leave a few times along the way. But yeah, basically started teaching in 2006, and then I kind of wrapped it up. I'd wrapped it up by 2016. So yeah, it was a short-lived career as it turned out, and certainly not what I'd anticipated. I had hoped that it was like the one. I thought, I've got this dream job. I'm an art teacher in a primary school. How much better could it get? But over time, I just discovered that a lot of the things that I was doing as kind of extra stuff was actually became the expectation. So things that I was doing for fun became part of my job description, and it started to suck the joy out of it for me. And so yeah, I decided I'd start working on my transition out, even though I wasn't really sure what that looked like. And so yeah, that's kind of where I began that journey.
Fabulous. Thank you for sharing that. And apologies for turning off the camera briefly, just a few technical issues. So I thought I'd let you finish sharing your story and just take care of those. But fascinating. And part of that theme that we'll be talking through today is, when you choose a vocation and you study and you work very hard at it, and then you get to a certain point where it's not working for whatever reason, and then making that transition. So given that you've gone through such a profound journey in many ways, what do you think then you would say to people is your idea of success? What do you think success means to you?
Yeah, okay. So I've obviously been thinking about this question a lot, and I think something that I say to my clients is you need to be living a life that aligns with your values and your priorities. So your values might be things around your faith, spirituality, or it could be just a commitment to the environment or whatever that is for you. That's one aspect, and then your priorities I think is slightly different. So for me, when I was first started teaching, I still had young children in school, and I wanted to be able to, support and nurture them in their educational journey as well. So that was one of my priorities. I'm married, so I wanted to be able to spend time with my husband. We were caring for his elderly dad as well, so I needed to factor that in. And I know there's a lot of people around my age, women of a certain age, who are in that sandwich generation now, where they've still got late teen or young adult children who they're still supporting in a lot of ways, even if it's just emotionally. And then they've also got elderly parents who they're caring for. So I guess my idea of success is to create a life for yourself that will allow you to live in alignment with all of those, having all of those balls in the air and still feeling like you're bringing something worthwhile into the world.
I really love, thank you, that's a fabulous explanation about what success means to you. And I think I really appreciate how you identified there's a difference between the values and the priorities, because yes, the priorities are very different when you're a single person to when you have young children, to, as you said, when you're a little bit older and you're in that sandwich state, and then older again where, you may have children that have left the nest, and parents that may or may not still be around. But those different stages of life, it's really important to understand that some of those values never change, but yes, the priorities change around what success means. And I know that many people watching today, whether it's children or older parents, that they're going through that same juggling act around priorities. And so it's important to know or understand that it's okay that those change as you go through life, and they don't necessarily need to stay the same all the way through. So given that you work a lot with teachers who come from vocations and like nurses and like doctors and like many kind of professions that take a lot of dedication to train and then work in, it is a vocation, and they're called vocations because people very much call to them. So I'm fascinated. I'm sure people are really interested in, given that people have trained and worked and become part of that vocation and then reached a point where they've gone, well, okay, it's not working for me for whatever reason anymore, I need to move and shift. What are some of the, and this will be quite fascinating, what are some of the mindset tips that you'd suggest that can be applied to everybody about that same kind of decision process and journey of going from where you are to where you want to be in the world?
Yeah, so I just want to pick up on that idea of the calling or the vocation. I think a lot of teachers do feel that way. And I actually spoke to a nurse the other day who's out on leave, and she a very similar kind of feeling. And she was fascinated that I help teachers, because she said, "Oh, do you help nurses as well?" Like, well, there are a lot of similarities. And I think there's also the aspect of it's in the case of nursing and teaching, and perhaps medicine as well, there's a certain altruism that goes along with that role, where you're expected to give, or there's an expectation that you'll do it for the children, or that you wouldn't possibly prioritize your own needs over the needs of your clientele, whoever they are, or the stakeholders in your environment. So of course you'll miss your coffee break to look after a patient, or of course you'll give up your recess or your planning time to have a conversation with a parent about a struggling student. And so what happens is there's this constant I guess this underlying expectation that you will do those things. And I think you're right, it's careers that are often associated with women, and so they're in that kind of nurturing role, and they keep doing it, and then they come home and they've still got their own family to nurture and care for, and there's a kind of tipping point where they just go, "That's it, I can't do this anymore." I feel like I may not have answered the question, Michelle. I'm sorry. Do you want to just ask me that again?
We can keep circling back to it, because I think you've raised a really good point around men or women, because it can be men sometimes as well, but people that can be naturally nurturing and that are attracted to these roles where it's not just a role, you actually become that persona. So you're nurturing the kids, nurturing, if you're a medical profession person, nurturing the patients, etc. And that nurturing element doesn't stop when you then finish your job and go home. You're then doing it with your family as well. And I think, yeah, when people, so much of themselves becomes part of the role that they're doing, I think that's where everybody's fascinated today. Well, how do you then help them to kind of disconnect from that role so that they can then move over to a new role, and what type of suggestions and tips you would give for people doing that?
Yeah, well, I think that's a really important point. It's about that disconnection, and that's really hard because if you've kind of become embedded in this persona of being a teacher or being a medical professional or whatever it is, it becomes part of who you are. Like when I said to my husband, I want to quit. And he was curious. He said, "Well, do you have any regrets?" I'm like, "I really regret that I had this title. I was a teacher, and I that's was part of who I was." And he was like, "Really?" He just didn't understand. And but I think that's really important, that you have to, as you're working on your plan to leave, I think it's really important that you begin to get yourself back. And so I probably was not a very good example, actually, and that's how I've ended up doing what I'm doing, because I could see the pitfalls along the way, that are things that I could have or should have done differently that would have made it a more successful transition for me. So, for instance, I only had a work email address because when I started teaching, we only had one email address as a family. Like we didn't, in the kind of almost before the internet, not quite, but I didn't know what a hyperlink was when I started teaching. So just going back to that, I created my work email, and I was like, oh, look at me. I'm a professional now, and I've got my own email address that's mine, that people can communicate directly with me. And it had everything. It had all my passwords. It had all these subscriptions that art magazines and things that I got. And it took me, as I realized I wanted to leave, it actually took me about 2 years to get all the passwords and all the things off that email address. So if there's any teachers out there or any nurses or professionals who want to leave their job, start doing that now, because often what happens is when you do say you're going to leave, particularly I've seen this so many times with teachers, sometimes the school will be quite vindictive and just cut you off. Then you can't email your colleagues, you can't tell your students or the parents that you've left, and more importantly, you can't access past emails. You might not be able to get hold of your intellectual property if it's tied up on the school computer system. There's a whole lot of things that can go terribly wrong, not to mention your passwords. And who knows, there might even be a very important email from a Nigerian prince that you're going to miss out on.
I think that's a really practical way of actually looking as well at that disconnecting yourself from that role. And I hadn't thought about the fact that, for many teachers and many people watching, they may have a lot of who they are and what they do in their everyday life contained within that work email space. And it goes to files, it goes to all sorts of things, especially when you're creating programs and creating your IP.
And also the school might own your computer. That's often the case, where the school actually owns the computer. So when I left, I had to go and fork out, $3,000 to buy myself my own computer, because I'd been using a school one for this, 7 or 8 years prior. So there are elements like that. But I think there's more to it than that, Michelle. I think there's also, you actually need to start creating the life that you want to live before you leave. So, for instance, if you've got an appointment or something and school says, I've got it, you need to come and stay back for this meeting, and unplanned, that happened a lot. Just say no, like, I can't, I've got something else on. And so I would start deliberately scheduling things in the afternoon so that I could legitimately say, I'm sorry, I can't do that extra thing that you want me to do because I've got an appointment. and I made sure that I left, Now, I didn't do that at the beginning, to be fair. It took me a long time to get to the point where I actually started to set those boundaries, and really kind of prioritize what I thought was important. But I have to say, too, sometimes it was easier to stay back at school and just do stuff, whatever, rather than come home to the crazy family stuff that was happening. So, so there's a bit of that, trying to work out, creating that balance between the crazy of work and the crazy of home, and making it all manageable. One of the things we did was we got a cleaning lady, which just kind of took a whole heap of pressure off. I know not everyone's in that position to be able to do that, but it was almost, that or not be married, like the house was in chaos and school was busy and the kids were busy and they all needed to be ferried wherever. And it was just something had to give. So that was one decision that we made, to just make life a little bit calmer and a bit easier. And it did help. And actually, we still have her, even though we don't really need her anymore, because she's awesome. And she was a mum at the school. That's how we met. So I still have lots of connections with my, the parents from the school and families from the school and ex-colleagues. But really the ones that were my actual friends, I guess other ways you can start that disconnection process is to go back to the stuff that you used to love to do and start doing it again. And that, of course, that's not always easy. But one thing I began doing was, we live quite close to a beautiful creek, and I hadn't really discovered it when we moved here because we had little children and it was just so hard to get everyone out the door, and so we didn't really explore it. But in my adult, sort of later adulthood, I started walking along the creek. And so sometimes in the summer I would come home and go for a big walk along the creek, which was just so lovely and so refreshing and so sort of spacious, and allow me to just decompress and have my own headspace for a little while, where I wasn't thinking about school and I wasn't thinking about home. So kind of creating that third transitional space between work and home, so that I was just, I don't know, I guess I was just a bit nicer, because I did that.
And I keep hearing this theme through a lot of what your wonderful tips you're suggesting, and it's around building those boundaries. So I think as we're talking about, it's not just unraveling yourself from the role in terms of work, but also unraveling yourself from the role when you go home as well, so that you create a kind of a third space, which is where you go for the walk along the creek, or you spend that time working on things that you want to do for yourself. And I know that for many people, like we're saying, it can be quite hard because there's so many pressures and there's so many, you're being pulled in so many different directions. But it's only when you start to create that space that you really get that headspace then to be able to think about whether things are working for you. And like you say, you become a nicer person because you've had that chance to decompress from whether it's the family or from work or from both. But I do hear how building those boundaries around, well, there's the work time, the family time, and then there's me time in there as well. Really help to start on that process.
A lot of the teachers in the Get Out of Teaching Facebook group talk about how they get home from work and park in their driveway or park around the corner from their house and just sit in their car for 20 minutes before they go inside, just to kind of create that little bit of space before they, take on their next role, just to, switch over. The company Starbucks, I'm pretty sure it's Starbucks, that they actually, that's why they existed in the first place, was to create a third space for people so that they could go from work to home and have somewhere to go in between.
Oh, fabulous. Yeah, and it makes so much sense. And I'm not surprised when you're talking about hiding in the car or spending time in the car to create that in-between zone. A wonderful woman that works in the relationship space, Louise Armstrong is her name. She talks about transitions, especially for men, transitioning when they come home and getting out of the work clothes and into their home clothes, And she talks about it in terms of relationships, that if you try to talk to them when they're still in work headspace, then you'll get the, monosyllabic answers.
Yeah.
If you give them the space to kind of transition from work into home space, then, when they're ready, they can kind of come and engage. But I know for many people watching, you're right, unless you create something like a Starbucks or a car moment, having that transition and can be quite difficult. And I know with some of the roles that I've been involved with, when I've been lucky enough to be able to walk to the client, one of the exciting parts about that has actually been that decompressing on the way home from the roles or on the way to the role, kind of getting my game head in, if you like, about what's going to happen. And it's been strange, I know, for many people these last couple of years, where those lines between work and home, and for teachers, you're teaching a class, and then you've also got your children around you that you're teaching at home as well. These tips around creating those boundaries and finding some space for yourself to have that mind clearing space is really, really important.
Yeah, and I think that whole remote work space has created a massive difficulty for teachers where, everyone's at home, they're all stuck with each other. I mean, I guess I'm kind of lucky if I had to teach now, which I didn't, but if I had to, I'm in a studio in my backyard, so I've got a separate space from the house. But if I was home with, my even high school kids, I think I probably would have quit my job, because it would have been so difficult to manage everyone on devices, all of us using the internet, like just so many elements to that. I can see why people have found it a really stressful thing, and why everyone's just trying to avoid going back to remote learning as much as they can, because it's really difficult to do all of those things that you're talking about, setting boundaries around your time. And schools are asking people, if they're home sick with COVID, to still teach online because they're so short staffed. So it's been a much more difficult job, I think, in the last couple of years than it probably ever has been historically before.
And I think that's a really great tip around, creating appointments so that you have a legitimate reason, and you could even work towards a point where you don't have a reason, but you still say no. No, I can't stay back for that meeting, or no, I can't take on that extra task, whatever it is. To again, in the business space, one of the things we do with people is work through how valuable is your time. So, is your hour worth $100, $200, whatever? And I'm sure with teachers and nurturing professions, if they start to think about, well, me doing that extra task at 4:00, so I don't get to start my marking or whatever until 5:00. That extra hour of work that I wouldn't necessarily get paid for, that's actually worth $200 to me. And if they started to value time in that sort of way, and think about, well, for $200, that's a plumber coming to visit nowadays for 15 minutes.
Yeah.
Putting it into that kind of perspective can actually help to value your time more and value your great expertise, because at the end of the day, it is still kind of a one or another thing. It's all choices, not that the choices are right or wrong or good or bad, but it's all still a choice. And valuing your precious time is the biggest way to really then support putting boundaries around, well, no, I don't have time for that. But rather than saying, no, I don't have time, saying, oh, sorry, I've got an appointment or something else that I've got to do.
Well, as I was trying to leave, I actually decided I'll do a Master of Applied Positive Psychology, because that was like, I was a teacher, so of course I went back to school again. And I try to discourage people from doing that now, because now I have more HECS debt. So there's always the downside to going back to study. But one of the good things about doing that was that I had to create space for that. And so I would set an appointment in my diary. I think it was Wednesday nights. I gave myself 4 hours on a Wednesday night, and I also did about 3 mornings a week where I worked from 5 to 7 a.m. which I don't know if I could do that again. But anyway, and the great thing about that was if my friend said, hey, do you want to come out tonight or whatever, I just say, oh, sorry, I've already got something on. And it was just so, it just rolled off the tongue, because I'd already created that space for myself. It also helped me to meet other people and get outside of that education sector. So I was actually starting to make connections with people who were better connections if I wanted to leave. So yeah, that was another helpful thing. I guess I'd throw that into the mix is start building your network of people who are not your close connections, but the ones like their friends, so that you're kind of going one step out in your connections, so that you're starting to meet new people who might be able to help you with your transition.
That's so true. And there's so many entrepreneur courses now, and like yourself, we work also with small businesses and people going through transitions and organizations going through transitions. But when I started, it was going to entrepreneur courses, and the one of the key things from that is that you meet other people going on similar journeys. So I think that that's really important. I'm sure that that's what happens with your Facebook group as well. People start to make those connections and then find out about other people and other areas and other ideas that they may not have thought of before. Yeah,
Absolutely.
Fabulous. And so training, I think going and studying some more is one way. I'm not sure necessarily like you found out doing another degree.
I think there's other ways you can do it. There are a lot of short courses that you can do that don't require you to give that level of commitment and cost, but can still be really valuable in terms of expanding your horizons. And I think that I think is it Adam Grant who talks about it, meeting it's the next level out of the connections. I just can't think of he's got a term for it. I just can't, it's eluding me at the moment. But that idea of the friends of your friends are going to have a different network. And so if you're only friends with teachers, that's not a very useful network to you. But maybe their partner or one of their friends might know other people who could recommend you for another job if you're trying to get out. So that is definitely something I would start working on. And I still do now. I'm, always connecting with wider connections so that I can, broaden my connection network.
And the same with Google. I mean, we're so lucky now with technology. You can actually Google all sorts of things. And if you're interested in a different field, whatever that field might be, you can then use something like LinkedIn, like you're saying, to look up people and find out, well, I might not be connected to them, but my sister-in-law's brother is best mates with this guy. So you can go to your sister-in-law's brother to get the introduction to somebody that might be in this field.
They're called weak ties. I just remember weak ties. So they're not your closest connections, but the next layer out. Yeah, definitely worthwhile doing that. Especially LinkedIn's great because you can see the kinds of people that work for the organization that you're interested in working with. Oh, there's so much we could talk about.
There is. But we are coming towards the end of time. So, Elizabeth, what's the best way for people to get hold of you?
Yeah, so my website's larksong.com.au, and my name's Elizabeth Diacos, so Diacos, pretty easy to find me. I'm on LinkedIn, Facebook, but larksong.com.au is where I've got some of the podcast episodes hosted, and also there's a link there to book a triage call with me, a free 10-minute call, which is a diagnostic conversation to look at where you are now and where you'd like to be and how we might bridge that gap. And there's also a scorecard there you can take, which is the Get Out of Teaching Readiness Scorecard, to see if you're actually ready to leave education, and it gives you some ideas about what you could do to, make the opportunities for yourself a little bit better, so that you can actually make that transition.
Fabulous. And if you were to say something to your younger self, because again, people grow up thinking, oh, I want to be a teacher or something, but what would you say to yourself? What would be some of your tips that you might give?
Yeah, I think what we've already kind of discussed is set some boundaries around your time, because it is your most precious resource. make sure you have a life out of work, outside of your work life, so that you've got this rich, well balanced life, regardless of what job you're in. And also, if you're sick, take sick leave. That's
Yeah,
it.
fabulous, fabulous tips for your younger self there, and
Yeah.
really insightful. And don't we all wish we had those sorts of insights when we were younger?
Yeah, I think it's all about just creating that space for yourself so that you can actually nurture yourself as well as everyone else in your world.
Yeah, yeah, fabulous. Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth. The time has flown by again, but it's been really lovely having you on the show today.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
And to everybody watching, thank you again for your ongoing support of the show. We really appreciate your feedback and your input. It really helps us to know that these suggestions and tips that people are giving each week are really helping you to build that mindset for success and keep looking to how your life and the influence that you can have in the world can keep growing and growing. But for now, from my heart to your heart, be yourself, be great, be fabulous, and be you. Bye.